First of all, let me thank the CCI for having invited me to discuss this today's scientific program. As all of us know, CCI has been contributing greatly in the academics in the pulmonology. And today, a very interesting talk by none other than Dr. Mahesh Gowda, a psychiatrist from Bangalore, a reputed institution, healthcare, Spandana Healthcare. And he is going to discuss on the breathlessness, whether it is more in the lungs, the airways, the windpipe, or it is in the temperament or the mindset of the person. It's an extremely difficult in few cases to really look into the evaluation of these patients, and we will definitely have great appreciation about what he is going to guide us in the scientific deliberation, and that will definitely benefit each and every one of us in managing these patients. I thank you again, CCI, for having invited me, and we'll go ahead. And I request all the people, the delegates who actually are joining here, should wait for their question answers till the end, so that we'll try to make this program a very interesting one. Thank you.
Welcome to today's program. And today I'm going to talk on very important aspects of interface between pulmonology and psychiatry. The important saying is the mind breathless or is it the lung that is breathless? Today I'm going to talk on how actually the mind and the lungs are going to play an important role in the management of disorders and how the presentation can vary. Next slide, please. I thought I could begin by talking about how important the lung is as a organ and how the lung being affected and diseased can cause extensive morbidity and mortality worldwide across the populations. The recent pandemic has actually thrown a lot of light on these sort of issues. When it comes to mood and anxiety symptoms, they're also very common in the lung disorders and very frequently occurring comorbidly. It's also often difficult to differentiate whether the symptoms are actually attributable to lung disorders or is it a part of the psychiatric condition or is it a part of lung issue and the psychiatric condition occurring comorbidly. Next slide. William Osler actually said that asthma is a disease, and when he's talking about a disease, he says it's all in the patient's mind, and how much a patient's mind is affected determines how severely the patient can be asthmatic. So this is the famous quote. I think even today it's true. Next slide. Asthma is known to have specific psychological features as seen with suboptimal asthma control, including a strong sense of denial, panic, fear, intense anxiety symptoms, and sometimes inappropriate coping skills. There's also a reduced functioning overall and leads to poor quality of life secondary to asthma and may lead to depression at times. The prevalence of depressive symptoms can be as high as 50% in various studies, but if you look at Indian scenario, the international scenario, and studies in various populations, even the least quoted numbers is as high as 25-30%. That means every other patient with asthma has actually underlying symptoms of depression. The prevalence of depression can be actually associated with the increased risk for sudden death related to asthma and generally is contributed by impaired voluntary drive to breathe as well as poor compliance with therapy. In spite of offering the best of the treatment, sometimes patients are poorly compliant and that determines the outcome of the disorder and people may not take medications. In spite of all the best of the counseling that you would have done to make sure the importance of medicine is stressed, sometimes the low mood actually drives to make people think that treatment is not important to them, or sometimes they feel helpless and they also feel hopeless about all the treatments and may not think that every treatment can make a difference with them, and sometimes poor compliance can actually lead to death at times and poor outcomes in asthma. Next slide. In people who present with asthma, they have symptoms of dyspnea, tightness of chest, and sensation of choking symptoms. And these are the people who commonly have anxiety disorders, and asthma symptoms and anxiety symptoms almost seem to be overlapping because these symptoms may mimic asthma in most of the times. We also have the dyspnea fear theory, where we have hyperventilatory syndrome, People have panic attacks arising out of an innate emotional response to severe breathlessness. The panic experienced by the individual is actually accentuated by the fear because of psychological response to hyperventilation. So dyspnea leads to fear, and fear in turn leads to dyspnea. So seems to be a interconnection between dyspnea and fear, and this has led to worsening of asthmatic presentations. Next slide. I thought I'll discuss an important scenario here. We have a scenario where we have a 24-year-old female working as a health professional. She's been a known case of asthma for the last 14 years and she's been on salbutamol. She presented with episodic shortness of breath, tightness of chest in the last 15 days. So this is a common scenario where people present to us. They are known to be asthmatic, they're known to be on treatment. Sometimes they still have episodes of shortness of breath and tightening of chest, and this can actually be an underlying symptom of anxiety. When I'm talking about 24, this is the age when they can have multiple roles functioning, transition. They begin the family, they begin their career, they may be actually doing a lot of academic related issues, and this is a time when it's very critical for people. And under intense stress, people have actually gone into shortness of breath and tightness of chest, and these are actually typical symptoms of anxiety and can sometimes be misread as worsening of asthma. Unless we take a clear, detailed history, understand how the patient is presenting and what has actually happened and what has led to this sort of worsening of symptoms, it will actually throw some sort of important new dimensions to the problem so that we can understand this patient better and treat this patient better. Next slide. I thought talking about the interplay of depression, anxiety, and life-threatening asthma attacks could be looked at how do they actually interplay among each other. There has been a high prevalence of denial and anxiety, and asthma patients actually have experienced near fatal attacks of anxiety. If you look at what can happen with people with asthma is they can have high prevalence of depression, they have poor cognition, poor sense of concentration and memory, low energy, low motivation, hopelessness, helplessness, and sometimes poor thinking abilities and clarity of what they actually intend to do. They can lead to also poor judgment and a lot of errors related to that. And if you look at what these sort of symptoms can do is, it can finally lead to poor treatment compliance, poor self-management of asthma, and sometimes asthmatic exacerbation do happen. So because of poor asthma control, it can lead to depression, and depression in turn can actually worsen the asthmatic control. So this sort of feedback loop can help us understand how depression can worsen asthmatic outcome negatively. Next slide. If you look at COPD and the interplay with psychiatric disorders, there are multiple studies that have shown that approximately 40% of patients who have COPD have lifetime diagnosis of major depressive disorder. When I'm talking about major depressive disorder, it can be symptoms of mild anxiety, it can be moderate or sometimes severe anxiety or depression underlying here. Patients who are depressed have high rates of smoking because if you look at what smoking can do, it is generally known to be a stimulant, and this has led to increased risk of COPD and worsening of the underlying illness there. Chronic hypoxemia is also being shown in rats to disrupt the synthesis and the release and replacement of noradrenergic receptors and also dopaminergic neurotransmitters in the brain, and which has actually in turn led to depression. So when these sort of animal models are looked at, there is enough evidence to understand that similar ongoing factors can also impact the brain functioning, and COPD generally has chronic hypoxemia and it can lead to reduced non-adrenergic and dopaminergic neurotransmitters in the brain, in turn leading to worsening of depression. Next slide. If you look at some of the studies that has been published, they're looking at association of anxiety and depression with pulmonary symptoms and also looking at how it actually has an impact on chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders. And they also looked at what is the prevalence of generalized anxiety disorders. Earlier we discussed about how it has an increased instance of major depressive disorders. Now we are looking at generalized anxiety disorders And here it is found that it is as prevalent as 15.8%, approximately 16% in people with COPD have symptoms of GAD. When we're talking about symptoms of GAD, here a person can have anxiety, sense of feeling of being on the edge, and something seems to be constantly worrying him, poor sleep parameters, poor appetite parameters, and sometimes the sense of constant worry and feeling of edge can also lead to worsening of baseline anxiety and lead to panic attacks. The patient never is able to relax and feel comfortable, and he never reaches the baseline level of comfort. Throughout the day, from morning till evening, there'll be something that keeps this patient worried and preoccupied all the time. Patient also misconstrued and understand the symptoms of breathlessness and actually has led to leading of heightened state of physiological arousal, which leads to additional misperception of sensation of dyspnea and exaggerated feeling of breathlessness. Next slide. Subjects who having primary diagnosis of schizophrenia seem to be more likely to have COPD symptoms according to a large-scale retrospective chart review analysis. The increased COPD rate can generally be attributed to the increased smoking rates among schizophrenics simply because something called self-medication or self-stimulation hypothesis. The stimulation of the central nervous system with the nicotinergic cholinergic receptors may actually improve the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So whenever somebody has the negative symptom of schizophrenia, he's generally lethargic, has no interest to do anything, he has no motivation, he has poor concentration, he has poor attention, he does not take care of himself in terms of personal care, he has no planning, and he has no goals and ambitions. So this is a typical way of people with negative symptoms of schizophrenia present, and people try to self-medicate themselves and stimulate themselves, and there's an increased risk of use of nicotine here, and has also led to worsening of COPD-like picture. Next slide. If you look at respiratory failure that can occur in ICU patients, psychiatric symptoms are more common to occur with people with ICU admissions, and following discharge, they also found to have more symptoms of depression, substance-related withdrawal symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and unwanted recall of unpleasant experience that they had during the ICU stay. Post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms also very common with people with respiratory failure. When I'm talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, these are repeated recollection of the traumatic event after some protracted period of time, and it seems to be replaying in the daytime, occasionally at sleep, and the patient tends to relive this sort of traumatic events, and it affects a significant proportion of patients after they've gone through a critical illness and admission, including respiratory failure. The reported incidence of PTSD after a critical illness varies anywhere between 4 to 25%. The lower end, you're talking about 4%, but on a higher end, it's almost 25%. So almost 1/4 of the people who have gone through this sort of critical illness and who are admitted have had symptoms of PTSD. So you can look at the high prevalence of comorbid psychiatric symptoms with people who've gone through respiratory failure. Depression, mostly the moderate or sometimes greater severity, affects nearly half of the ICU survivors. People are able to get treated, they get the best of the treatment options, and whatever has been done during the emergency has left to some sort of aftermath after the treatment, and more than 43%, up to 50% of the survivors have had symptoms of moderate depression, which can in turn affect the quality of life and the treatment-related outcomes of the underlying respiratory issues itself. Next slide. If you look at people who are coming out of respiratory failure, who's been intubated, and who are actually being tried to wean out, these are people also very commonly predisposed to having a lot of psychiatric comorbid presentations. They can have common acute confusion state, something like a delirium. They can have anxiety symptoms, which can be something like generalized anxiety symptoms, or it can have intense severe attacks of anxiety leading to a panic sort of presentation. They can have depression. Here it could be mild, moderate, or severe also. They can also present with severe agitation, Sometimes they have residual or deficient sedation, and they have non-refreshing sleep, loss of independence, and sometimes a lot of sedation in the daytime is what is very common. They also have this sort of repeated reliving experiences of nightmare, something like PTSD sort of presentation, sometimes non-restorative sleep, and they don't feel fresh even after sufficiently sleeping for 6 to 8 hours time. So when they don't sleep well, in turn, they have poor outcomes in terms of whatever physical, occupational, and other psychological outcomes that generally happen during the morning time or the daytime period when they actually are supposed to do a lot of constructive abilities and work. Next slide. This is something that would explain the evidence of association of psychiatric disorders in pulmonary disorders. And this actually table explains how common psychiatric disorders present with asthma, COPD, cystic fibrosis, respiratory failure, and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, sarcoidosis. So what's very common is most of them have said that underlying COPD or having asthma has led to major depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, substance abuse related phenomena, and sometimes they've also talked about schizophrenia, eating disorders, PTSD sort of symptoms in people with cystic fibrosis and respiratory failure. So there is a direct connection between having underlying psychiatric disorders in people with pulmonary disorders. There's also a high degree of level of association, and the level of association is at least 2A or sometimes up to level 3. And the other list of medications that are commonly known to work here is group of SSRI group of medications, the fluoxetine, sertraline, paroxetine group of medications, or doxepin, the age-old tricyclic antidepressants. SSRI like citalopram also is known to be very commonly effective. Next slide. I thought next I'm going to talk about a scenario where a 21-year-old female working in the IT sector presented to a pulmonologist with difficulty in breathing. She was sweaty, she had shaking of the body, weakness, and feeling of impending doom lasting for 10 to 15 minutes or sometimes even longer for the last 2 weeks. So this is also a very common presentation when people face this sort of scenarios. If they've gone to casualty, a lot of doctors have actually tried the best to underlying stressors could be elicited here, trying to look at what actually has led to this sort of presentation. And so many times when we don't have time, we tend to overlook this sort of presentation. We think it could be only related to the cardiac times or related to the underlying pulmonological related issues, and they land up in ICU sometimes and leading to extensive investigations. A lot of interventions are done, and finally it turns out to be just a case of panic disorder. If you look at the presentation, it says worsening for the last 15 days. It's good to spend at least 1 or 2 minutes and try and find out what exactly happened in this 15 days. Was there any underlying stressor? Was there any other correlating factors that actually led to the patient's poor outcome here? Next slide. The next important thing is psychogenic cough. If you look at what Google has done is it's actually been very effective in creating a lot of hypochondriacs, and you can easily make out that people who have actually read the internet and actually come to the evaluation are actually more difficult to handle. And we also talk about how difficulty it is to convince people with any of your underlying diagnosis that you have made or the treatment option that you give, because they most probably have their own diagnosis before they come to you, and they're trying to look at a medicalization for the diagnosis. They come in way of evaluation, treatment, and management of all these disorders. And one such presentation would be the psychogenic cough. People who are having chronic cough without any underlying physiological cause are generally the common people with hypochondriasis. They also have something called habit cough. Something like irritation in the throat can happen. It's something like a vocal tick, and sometimes they have the habit of trying to clear throat and keep coughing, though there's nothing that is evident physiologically, they get into a system where they try to cough. It is more common in children, and as they grow older and become adults, they tend to ignore and are able to get distracted. They're able to handle this psychological cough better. And if you look at the prevalence of diagnosis of psychogenic cough, it is as high as 3 to 10% at times in children with cough of unknown origin persisting greater than 1 month. They generally are dry, repetitive, a honking sort of character that usually occur during sleep sometimes. So psychogenic cough is something that becomes a diagnosis by rule of exclusion. And again, underlying psychological issues is something that we must keep in mind. Having excessive concern of illness, wellness, and being educated on the Google has actually complicated the presentation and also the management of people with psychogenic cough. Next slide. A distinguishing factor between psychogenic cough and that of asthma is that during exacerbation, asthmatics are often awakened with cough sometimes, and we must always look at underlying organic factors before we conclude this as just psychogenic. And also, asthmatics typically state that the cough originates from the chest and they have a deep underlying presentation, and they say it comes from the bottom of the lungs, whereas patients who have habit cough tend to localize the symptoms to throat. And if you look at carefully the history, the presentation, and underlying factors, it will be able to give us some sort of clarity and distinguish what was a habit cough and what is generally a typical cough because of underlying chest disorders. Generally, reassurance to the patient and family is very helpful. Biofeedback, giving some sort of supportive therapy, and sometimes habit reversal using aversive techniques have been used to suppress this sort of psychogenic cough presentation. Next slide. The next important thing is the hyperventilation syndrome that is commonly there, and it is typically described way back in 1937, where patient had presented with tachypnea, which led to respiratory alkalosis, which in turn can lead to tetany at times or syncope in some severe cases. So people who commonly present here are the people who are the young females who are generally having underlying psychological issues, and there'll be an underlying stressor or a conflict which don't have resolution, and they're unable to have some sort of coping mechanism to deal with their trouble, and these people present with hyperventilation syndrome. And people typically have short, deep breaths, and they keep breathing heavily, and the respiratory rate can be as high as 35 or 40 times some scenarios. And the incidence of this syndrome varies from 6 to 11% and generally is known to have a higher female preponderance. The syndrome tends to occur in about a third to fourth decade of their lifespan, and can actually affect people at any age is also being talked about. So most of the situation are there during the third and the fourth decade, and even if it occurs early, you cannot actually rule out this sort of syndrome simply because the conflicts tend to happen at any time. And whenever somebody is prone to conflict, coupled with the underlying poor coping mechanism, they can have precipitating of hyperventilation syndromes. Next slide. Coming to look at how stress can have an impact on us, having unemployment, having a work also can be a stress. Sometimes having illness can be a stress, and a lot of other underlying factors like losing somebody in the family where they can have grief-related symptoms, underlying bullying sort of presentation in the school and college atmosphere, losing your partner by death or by divorce also can be an important stressor for people, having chronic pain because of various medical issues or even psychological issues, having a new baby or having any of the life events can be an important issue. Excessive fear can be an important aspect of stress for people. Having a new job when they feel that they don't have the required coping mechanisms can also be one of the stress here. all these parameters of stress can in turn lead to hyperventilation sort of presentation. They can have an overall sense of feeling unwell, can have increased anxiety presentation, which in turn can lead to more hyperventilation and worsening of the symptoms. And this could be a whole hyperventilation cycle. Stress will beget hyperventilation, and hyperventilation also can increase further symptoms and accentuate the presentation of hyperventilation. Next slide. There's actually a need to liaison because not all cases that present to us have to be assumed as psychological causation. It's good to rule out the underlying organicity here, and once we have taken a careful history and ruled out organicity, the possibility of psychological causation and evaluation would be needed. Anxiety and depressions are associated with a higher level of fatigue, shortness of breath, and frequency of COPD symptoms. And there's a very clear bidirectional phenomena and relation between psychiatric presentation and underlying pulmonary disorders. It's important for clinicians to be aware that the presence of anxiety and depression in COPD patients can lead to poor treatment and also poor outcomes simply because compliance is a very important factor. The poorly motivated people, the poorly compliant people are the people who are generally having some sort of psychological issues which otherwise would need evaluation and treatment. The psychiatric adverse effects of other prescribed medicines is also overlooked when we are actually diagnosing psychiatric disorders, sometimes leading to erroneous diagnosis of a primary psychiatric disorders. A common presentation would be using the montelukast sort of medication here can have worsening of psychiatric disorders, and it can be secondary to just use of montelukast. Next slide. I want to discuss an important case scenario where we have a 12-year-old female child presenting with chief complaints of a psychotic symptom here, hearing of voices, having her own thoughts being heard aloud, and anxiety symptoms. She was a known case of asthma and was recently prescribed montelukast once a day. Her mood on evaluation was one of being very anxious. She also had a thought presentation here where she had thought echo, that is hearing of one's own voices aloud. She had second person auditory hallucination also as a presentation. She was diagnosed to have a case of acute schizophrenia like psychotic disorder and was started on risperidone 2 mg, and to prevent EPS she was started on triaxiphenidil 2 mg per day. On review, after 2 weeks her symptoms still persisted. This could be simply because sometimes using montelukast can worsen the symptoms of anxiety and has also led to worsening of psychotic symptoms and presentation. Sometimes changing the class of medications, taking off the offending drug has led to recovery and improvement. Even if you go higher on antipsychotics at times may not be really helpful and sometimes has led to more side effect profile and not actually a relief in the primary psychotic symptoms or anxiety symptom presentation. So if there's a typical temporal correlation with the onset of symptoms and an additional medication that you would have started, try and look whether this can be correlated as something worsening, or is this drug really known to cause worsening of the psychiatric presentation is what we must keep in mind. It is not a very common phenomena. It is generally very rare, but still I thought we should still keep this sort of presentation in mind. It can happen in less than 10% of the population, and sometimes having this sort of presentation can go undiagnosed. We can keep increasing the dose of antipsychotics, changing the dose of antipsychotics, sometimes make erroneous interpretation that this is a case of primary treatment resistant psychotic symptom, and we may label them differently. So having a watch on what we've actually started and how this actually symptoms have evolved can lead to some sort of clarity in the way we could manage this sort of presentations. Next slide. Yet another important drug that we commonly use in treatment would be corticosteroids. Corticosteroids are actually used in various pulmonary disorders and associated with mood disturbances. In people who are otherwise euthymic and having no symptoms of mood at all, have led to elated mood, symptoms of increased psychomotor activity, anger, irritability, less need of sleep, poor attention concentration, disinhibition, mood lability, and frequent change of mood in some cases. We can also have some presentation where they've actually gone into the other spectrum of presentation where people have had depression. When I'm saying depression, these are people having pervasive sadness, no interest to do any activities, have lost interest in what they generally used to enjoy, no interest in hobbies, no interest in occupation and functioning, poor attention and concentration, sometimes feeling that life is not worth living, helplessness, hopelessness, worthlessness, and sometimes suicidal ideation is also very common. They also can have cognitive related changes. Less commonly, we've had steroid psychosis where they're present with hallucinations and delusions, occurring most frequently within the first 2 weeks of starting of the therapy. So, if you were to look at the temporal correlation, you would have started steroid treatment and would have led to worsening of psychiatric symptoms here. So, having this sort of clarity in the history would lead to a proper diagnosis, evaluation, and treatment. Sometimes use of steroid and psychiatric symptoms are dose related, with patients receiving prednisolone at a dose of 40 to 80 milligrams per day are at moderate risk, that's around less than 5%, and those receiving more than 80 mg per day could have higher chance of having psychiatric symptoms and presentation and also having adverse effects related to the medication itself. Next slide. Leukotriene receptor antagonist, we talked about montelukast. So here what I'm trying to say is it's not a very common thing, but have been used by many physicians, pulmonologists in the treatment of asthma for both acute and chronic stages of management. It's a very rare side effects and also increase sometimes suicidal behaviors, agitation, aggression, anxiousness, panic sort of symptoms, dream abnormalities, hallucinations, depression, irritability, restlessness, and tremor at times. So we must understand, though this is very commonly used, uncommon presentations sometimes go missed, and trying to have an eye of suspicion, trying to understand who are the people who can have this sort of psychological worsening of symptoms can lead to better understanding of the patients and management. Next slide. We've all been through this pandemic scenario. If not for the pulmonologist, I really don't know how this world would have managed this pandemic. Pulmonologists have really worked hard during this testing times, have really stood up to the crisis and have actually delivered a lot of change during COVID-19 scenario. A recent article in Lancet Psychiatry found that around 18.1% of COVID positive patients had psychiatric symptoms, and within 14 to 19 days after the infection, they also could have this sort of psychiatric presentation. There were three categories of patients. First, where the coronavirus directly affected the brain and caused some sort of psychological symptoms and psychiatric presentations. Second set of people where they have existing mental health problems and led to some sort of worsening. And third set where the mental health issues were a result of the complications that were caused by the infection. So we have had all set of people, and this sort of varied presentations is very common, and symptoms of anxiety, depression, delirium, memory loss were most common manifestations seen during COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. Coming to look at what is the impact of psychological issues on COVID-19 pandemic scenario and doctors' mental health care. So if you look at, we've had various level of stresses here. The roles of the work and the demands and the recovery experience was something that was worthwhile to look at. And they've said that physical and mental health impacts of COVID-19 on healthcare workers is a new thing that needs to be reviewed. And there are enough evidence to say that the mental health of doctors during COVID-19 pandemic was severely affected. And the most common presentation with all this sort of phenomena of pandemic affecting the healthcare workers and doctors was they've had sleep-related disturbances, they've had more instances of substance abuse, they've had issues with major depression, worsening of underlying depression at times, anxiety disorders, sometimes having severe issues of conflict and interpersonal relationship issues. This sort of dedication and the work demand that happened during pandemic has led to a lot of psychological issues at family level, psychological issues on the well-being, and people have had poor work atmosphere related issues again. And all these stressors has led to more psychological factors affecting the healthcare workers, leading to more psychological syndromes like depression, anxiety, and sleep-related issues. Next slide. Again, I thought I'm going to quote William Osler here. The good physician is the one who treats the disease, but the great physician is the one who treats the patient who's had the disease. And treatment of the disease is really not the only thing that we need to do. Treating the patient who has the disease becomes the most important aspect of understanding a patient and evaluation. It's good if you can spend some time trying to understand the presentation, spending an additional 3 to 5 minutes of clarification, understanding the way the people have actually had this sort of worsening of underlying medical issues can throw a lot of light on how this patient could be effectively managed. An additional 3 minutes can mean a lot in terms of the patient's comfort and understanding. Having a good understanding of the psychological issues can definitely lead to better understanding of the patient's underlying physical disorders, pulmonological issues, and various other medical issues, and has always led to better understanding of the patient and better outcome. I take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for having been able to attend this sort of program, make this sort of program a great, successful event. And I'm thankful for the organizers for having given this opportunity for me to address this sort of elite crowd on CCI. And I would like to talk another occasion if there's anything that comes up. If there are any important issues of questions and clarification that you would need, I'll be more than happy to take it up. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Mahesh, for a very vivid and elaborate scientific review on the cases who can have breathlessness that can mimic bronchial asthma. There can be overlap. There can be combination of both the illnesses coming up together. And you have very well tackled the issues right from the ICU, the patients who are on ventilator, post-op cases, the surgery trauma cases. And of course, there are lots of medical psychiatry related illnesses which can present either to a pulmonologist or to the psychiatrist. And you are really given a very vivid kind of approach in the differentials of these patients. Although there can be a rare presentations, you have also included the drug related causes. And of course, these patients will require tailor making of the therapy. That is one separate area. But whatever you have deliberated today, it would be of immense useful to the audience, to all the pulmonologists, the delegates they have attended. We have few questions for you. I'll just see Dr. Vinod. Yeah, Dr. Vinod Shah from Vadagam. He's interested to know when the patient is complaining of a symptom of half breath or shallow breath, or when the patient is breathing but he is having no satisfaction in the normal breath. What does this symptom relate to, and how do we manage these patients?
Thank you for the question, sir. Generally, we have this sort of atypical presentations, and it becomes a very gray area to understand. Most of us want to have a control on our respiratory rate, though a lot of things are autonomic and out of our control. The sense of wanting to be under control is very important. When you're talking about a shallow breath, most of the time, I think since it's automatic and autonomic function, there will be enough oxygen delivered to the lungs, but the patient's subjective interpretation is an issue here. Generally, we can have a lot of cognitive distortion. The same parallels can be drawn with sleep also. There are a lot of people who sleep well, a good 6 to 7 hours, but when they get up, they say they didn't sleep at all. But the other spouse or the family member staying with the patient is able to vouch and say that they've actually slept well. most of the times is understood as a cognitive misinterpretation phenomena, sir. Generally happens with people who are hypochondriacal, people who are anxious, and generally who are in the neurotic spectrum of category.
Another question that comes to you from Amit Tikku, Mumbai. He's wanting to know the differentials of acute panic attack and breathlessness, and what should be one's approach in managing patients who are in panic attack and primarily having breathlessness as the symptom.
Generally, I think the golden rule should be, unless otherwise proved, everything is organic, because there's a very small window of opportunity for us to intervene and save somebody with a medical complication, which is cardiac or pulmonary presentation here. When somebody has this sort of profile, after you've done your physical examination in an emergency room, I think everything is quick. You have to do a lot of things within the first 1 or 2 minutes. Try and understand how the patient is presented to you, what is the actual physical examination findings, but also try and look at does he have the typical standard textbook description of being a prototype case of a worsening of asthma. If there's generally anything atypical, try and spend a little more time and see, for example, if the patient didn't have fall in oxygen saturation, didn't have cyanosis, didn't have a lot of chest findings on your evaluation, they could have other similar presentation. If you look at a syndrome of panic attack, a patient can have a lot of symptom overlap here. Close to 90-95% of symptoms are very similar to one of having an asthmatic attack and worsening. He can present with tremulousness of hand. He can have a racing heart, shortness of breath. He can have a sense of air hunger, wanting to breathe a little more than what he generally used to do. He can have tachypnea. He can have butterflies in the stomach. He can have a sense of being on the edge, a sense of losing control on everything, sense of feeling he's an impending doom sort of situation where he may not live the next moment. So this is the typical cognitive distortion of somebody who is having a panic sort of attack, which is generally lacking during the asthmatic attack, which is organic. Spending an additional 2 or 3 minutes just to understand his profile when he's presenting could actually add a lot of clarity. But unless otherwise proved, I think everything is an organic cause. And once you've ruled it out, I think it goes to the psychological category.
So another question that comes from Dr. Vinod Yadav, his query is how common is the depression in clinical practice, in general practice, and what is the overlap of anxiety, depression, and breathlessness, and what should be the medical management of such patients?
I thought I'll take the first question, looking at how common depression is in a general population. If you look at a developed country like USA, every other person is on an antidepressant, is what the newspaper articles talks about, and they talk about the typical SSRI Prozac. So there are tons of Prozac being prescribed, and every other person has used it for anxiety, depression, and stress management. So most of them actually have had a lifetime prevalence of depression, and that could be as high as 50% what they talk about. But if you look at an Indian scenario, people who have had major depressive disorder can be anywhere up to 12% as a lifetime prevalence. There are people who are more prone based on the profile of presentation, their age, their sex, as in preponderance. The female sex generally has more incidence of having depression. People having underlying psychological stressors, occupational stressors, people who are having multiple life events like death, divorce, having a newborn, having loss of job, all those things can complicate the presentation. So the least that you can think is at least 12% would be an average prevalence in a lifetime of an individual. So, sir, I missed the second half of the question. You asked me about depression. The other thing I missed, sir.
Panic attack and bronchial asthma, if all three coexisting, how should be the medical approach in managing these patients?
I think as a medical team, you would manage asthma to the best possible abilities. But how do we actually make the outcomes better is what I could talk about here. If you're looking at somebody who's just presenting with anxiety and hyperventilation as a common presentation, people have actually used various techniques like, paper bag techniques, what they generally do to just to abort an attack of panic. and generally trying to help him remain distracted, help him relax and calm down, helping him imagine in vivo, in his own imagination, the situation that gives him the maximum comfort and pleasure. It could be actually something very tailor made. You can ask him what actually gives him the maximum relief. He can think of just staying on the riverside, on a seashore, or doing some of his hobbies, that is listening to music. All those things would have given him some sort of comfort and pleasure. Trying to reinforce this sort of relaxation by imaginative techniques is something that can help people relax. On a long-term management, doing yoga, exercises, and good work-life balance is all that can help people manage the stress levels and also help manage their anxiety and depression presentation. So what really works for somebody with a panic sort of presentation is a pill, generally using clonazepam sublingual formulation. Generally helps him get the sense of control. A lot of things could be still a placebo response, but most of them, when you give a sublingual clonazepam, are able to report recovery from signs of panic and shortness of breath, which is psychological in nature, within the first 5 to 10 minutes. So as an SOS pill, sometimes using benzodiazepine has helped. On a long-term management, a lot of other sort of supportive therapies, relaxation therapies, yoga, lifestyle modification, exercise, all those things are really important, sir.
Now the question from Bhavya Shah from Ujjain. Her question is, if the patient is requiring corticosteroids for the proper control of the asthma, and he also has a steroid-induced psychosis. So now in these patients, it is extremely difficult to withhold steroids. What should be one's approach in managing such patients?
I think steroids have been life-saving, and as a medical team, you would know and rationalize the use of steroids. When it's absolutely essential and it has to be used, there's no second thoughts about it. We use it with caution, use the right doses. But if somebody has had underlying psychiatric issue and there's a worsening of symptoms, would need dose titration to make sure the symptoms are stabilized. If somebody has had a psychotic breakdown, addition of antipsychotic, the typical antipsychotics are being used earlier, but most commonly used atypical antipsychotics now is risperidone, quetiapine, olanzapine. All those things have had a good control on the psychotic breakdown, and people have had relief. So optimizing the doses of antipsychotics once the symptoms are controlled in the long run could be tailor-made and reduced also.
So Dr. Vijay Kumar from Hyderabad, his question is, can you please throw some light on the post-traumatic stress disorder?
If you look at PTSD as a symptom, it's a very frightening experience for most people who had it. People having panic attacks, they have a sense of dying every moment, and every second really matters to them. But when you're looking at PTSD, these are very significant, very stressful, traumatic events. This is something that they wouldn't have experienced in a lifetime. Something like an accident, sexual abuse, intensity of that sort of stressor in psychological nature is something that triggers this sort of PTSD sort of phenomena. People who have this sort of experience tend to relive the whole experiences over a period of time in terms of having nightmares during sleep. Throughout the day, the preoccupation is about a traumatic event, and it's very hard for them to forget and move on. Most of the time, they've had underlying baseline anxieties, which is very high. They cannot rest, they cannot relax, and a sense of being on the edge and feeling of loss of control is always there. They have severe sleep disturbances. People who suffer from some PTSD for long duration also get into severe depression and sleep-related issues. And unless these sort of PTSDs are managed, it can lead to very poor outcome of whatever occupational, social functioning, or even otherwise the quality of life.
This is a very interesting question by Dr. Vijay Kumar again. Dear Dr. Mahesh, how do you manage your stress? How much sympathy, empathy you deliver to your patients? And is it feasible for a psychiatrist to manage the patient's situation in sympathy, empathy?
I'm sorry for the background noise. My dogs are barking. Please excuse me for that. I will take this question. When you get trained in psychiatry, I think a lot of training would emphasize on how do you actually disconnect from the patient. 1 minute, sir. I'll just silence the dogs. Just a minute, sir. Sorry, sir. As a part of training, every postgraduate who goes through this period of training for 2 or 3 years, the art here is to disconnect once you've seen the patient. So many times you would do your best and not want to think about the patient after going back home. But this sort of reliving experience of seeing a very difficult patient, somebody would have been in a lot of emotional distress. At the end of the day, from morning till evening, you would have seen so many people with distress, and every other person would have talked about emotional difficulties, and nobody is there who would have shared his positive emotional impacts on his life. People rarely come to a psychiatrist to share happiness, and most of them come with trauma. So by the end of the day, it's very difficult that you would have not seen even one normal person. Everybody would have talked about their agony. So it's a very tough task. If you see more number of people, a lot of people also go into burnout, and I'm actually a survivor of burnout. Actually, I had difficulties in sleep. I really struggled for close to 1 year to have a restorative sleep, and I had to do a lot of other disconnecting jobs. I started reliving on hobbies, doing a lot of exercise to come out of this sort of burnouts. Sympathizing with the patient is very important, but there's definitely a spectrum. On the lower end of the spectrum, you're looked at as a very bad doctor. And when you can empathize and sympathize too much with the patient, I think that also will be in one extreme of the thing, when you'll not have the sense of professional edge over managing a patient. So everything has to be used in the right proportion. I talked about burnout simply because all of us are prone to burnout, and we have to use empathy, sympathy in the right proportion. The more empathetic you are, you're a very good quality doctor. The more you sympathize, I think it can take away our professional edge when you're talking to our client. Thank you, sir.
So Dr. Sweta from Hyderabad wants to know what should be the management plan for hyperventilation syndrome.
Generally, if you look at somebody who's present with hyperventilation syndrome, the background is one of a conflict. There'll be something in the recent past, maybe 1 day, 2 day, or a week's time, where this person would have lost the sense of control over certain issues, and by feeling helpless and not being able to manage this sort of situation, they generally present with this sort of hyperventilation attack. These are the people who are also more prone to anxiety. These are the people who lack some sort of communicative skills, social skills, and they may have problems with self-esteem. So addressing these sort of issues would be looking at the background of presentation, looking at how this patient actually got into this sort of conflict. Unless we address this sort of conflict, rarely the resolution of the symptoms can happen. It may take 1 or 2 sessions, spending a good quality time, taking the help of allied psychologists, social workers, sometimes an expert opinion from a psychiatrist. All those things can throw a little more clarity on the presentation. Supportive work needs to be done, trying to remove this patient from the conflict areas, trying to empower the patient to deal with this sort of difficult scenarios in terms of skill enhancement, helping the person to deal with an offensive family member. All those things will need some time. But in a short course, I think use of anxiolytics and a low dose antidepressant can help to tide over the crisis of stress for them.
So Dr. Vijay Kumar has one more question for you. This is pertaining to the ICU delirium. Your comments, and invariably ICU patients are separated, segregated a little away from the family members, and visitors are not permitted for longer duration. So what would your advice for such patients?
I think staying in a hospital is very frightening, and staying in an ICU sort of setup is even more frightening. A typical example would be the COVID scenario, where everybody were picked up from home against their wish for reasons of government protocol, and they were unable to connect with their families, see them virtually in person. But some people, because they've had a contact over video conferencing, phones, and talk, was really protected. There's so many people who didn't have families at all, and they have no means of communication. These are the people who actually go into a very frightening, threatening sort of experiences in the ICU. The medical illnesses itself are more complex to handle. Having these sort of underlying psychological issues can complicate the patient's symptoms and presentation. The threat perception that I may not go out of this ICU alive, I may live with disability, or I may not be able to see my near and dear ones, is something that really plays on the psyche of an individual. Having severe anxiety during this sort of ICU stay is very common. They don't sleep well unless you restore the sleep parameters. Again, they're not very relaxed. When sleep is not there, when they're extremely frightened and anxious, we use multiple medications also that can contribute to acute confusion state. Delirium generally happens, and it's a very difficult experience for people because of sleep-wake cycle disturbances. They also get into confusion state. So trying to keep the people more in a calm, relaxed atmosphere, making sure he's oriented to day and night shift in some way, making sure he knows the time of the day, making sure he's able to connect with somebody who he can relate to well, who's more comforting and soothing experience, is something very helpful. As a treatment team, we being empathetic and actually showing that sort of concern and supporting in whatever way. Just simple thing like, when we talk to our patients, the COVID has actually created a lot of barriers and distance. But if not for COVID, just a simple pat, trying to just say a pat, physical touch is something that can actually allay the patient's anxiety and apprehension in a big way. So COVID has created barriers. I can understand all of us are prone to get into risk of infection that's actually worsened, delirium presentation.
In fact, the next question is pertaining to sleep again. Most of the obstructive sleep apnea patients have mood disorders. So do you feel only correcting the sleep disorder or the obstructive sleep apnea is good enough, or do they require any further medical management for their mood or the psychiatry issues?
Generally, if you look at obstructive sleep apnea, very common presentation, either they go to a pulmonologist or they come to a psychiatrist because the problem is snoring, non-restorative sleep, and some sort of daytime hangover, sedation, not able to concentrate and work is a very common presentation that they come to us also. We would have always thought that it's a primary insomnia sort of issue unless you actually probe and look at his sleeping parameters. So they can also get misdiagnosed as primary psychiatric illness. You tend to medicate them and try to correct them, use benzodiazepines, use a lot of other therapies to help them fight insomnia. But I think unless you correct the obstructive sleep apnea parameter, just giving medication to sleep will not help. So once you've corrected the obstructive sleep apnea, most of them are able to sleep well. They have restorative sleep and their mornings are generally fresh and they can able to manage. If sometimes for whatever reason, even after correction of the obstructive sleep apnea, they still have sleep disturbance, restoring this good 5 to 6 hours of refreshing sleep is very important. Using zolpidem sort of medications, sometimes using benzodiazepine also can help them to have restorative sleep. Something that is not habit forming is just simple low dose tricyclic antidepressant like amitriptyline. I think all of us are used to prescribe 10 mg, 25 mg for this patient. Generally tends to restore the patient's sleep parameters, also helps to control anxiety and depression in a larger way. Unless they have underlying depression or anxiety, after correcting the sleep parameters, may not need primary management of depression with antidepressants.
In fact, one question from my end, like there are lots of patients nowadays, they are sustaining with chronic severe COPD, and maybe some of them are on home oxygen therapy to support to their life, and the survival has improved. They might have frequent exacerbations and hospitalization. Likewise, chronic persistent asthma, which may be there in the adolescent age group and the productive years. These are the subset of patients due to their illness, they are not able to cope up for their physical demands or maybe work-related absenteeism. So how frequently you come across with the mental affections for these subset of patients?
I think it's not a very common presentation in the clinic that where I work. We are a tertiary care center having a postgraduate training. Very rarely, probably I would maybe 3 or 4 in 3 to 4 months time. Average 1 or 2 patients in a month is what we look at. I think if you look at this set of population that you're talking about, these are high on morbidity, and the fear of getting into a stage where something can be reversible is something that can make people really anxious and worried. And the worried well is very common even without problems. But somebody who's had these sort of disabling respiratory disorders can actually have high prevalence of anxiety and depression, because they're not able to maintain their activities of daily living and function in a normal way because of whatever limitation that comes with obstructive, talking about COPD worsening and exacerbation. They're not able to meet their own expectations. So when they don't meet their expectations, there's an inherent fear that, they're a failure. They're not able to support the family in a lot of ways. And when they have this sort of presentation, they get into a stage of helplessness, and depression can be a very common presentation.
So, in fact, this is another interesting question. Do you suggest to tame a dog for physicians for a strong stress reliever?
I think for long, if you look at how dogs have evolved, dogs were actually in the wild, and man has successfully domesticated them, and it's very mutual. Dog has found a safe home, and for us, pet therapy is something that we generally look at. For people who cannot communicate well, for people who otherwise are at risk of getting into a lot of psychological distress, having a pet in whatever form, it could be dog, cat, a fish, actually has been a major source of distraction. Once you get involved in the routine of upbringing of a dog, you have a preoccupation, looking at their needs, concerns. When you have this sort of care and affection that you give to an animal or a pet like this, the sort of reciprocation that you get is really unconditional. Most of them are able to connect to this sort of animals better, and that's why a dog has become the man's best friend. Pet therapy is generally recommended for people for distraction, for management of anxiety, for management of people who otherwise are amotivated. If people who have, I'm not talking about a doctor, if people who had major psychiatric illness don't have the innate desire to form a schedule and follow them, having a pet can ensure that he gets up on time. I have 2 dogs at home, and you heard the barking of them. So whether you like it or not, they're going to bark at 6:30, wake me up, and make sure I take them for a walk. And they have a schedule in which I have to also adjust. So you get involved, and connecting to dogs and connecting to any sort of pet can actually be a stress buster and stress reliever for most of us.
So Dr. Vinay from Kuberpur, he is wanting to know what are the safest sedation for the COPD patients?
Generally, I think short-acting benzodiazepine or zolpidem is something that I'm very comfortable to use. For reasons of safety, it's good to start slow. Even if you're talking of zolpidem, using 5 or less than 5 at sometimes to begin with, and titrating to required dose is useful. I've always found relieving anxiety and underlying sleep disturbance much better with using clonazepam. And also, if you've had issues of addiction formation or habit forming, using tricyclic antidepressant is something that is useful. Very rarely I use the long-acting drugs. I want some drug that's going to work quickly and leave the system. Somebody should be able to get up fresh and not have hangovers. If we actually try to use melatonin, agomelatine, all those things have helped us. But somehow, when it looks at the patient's comfort and their recommendation, if you look at the patient's drugs of choice, what they really respond well, it would be a benzodiazepine group of medication. Zolpidem and melatonin are the preferred ones by doctors, but somehow patients may not have the required, relief with the sleep-related parameters.
The question from Dr. Delphine Munisha is, what is the medical management of paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea?
I think this is definitely a question which, as a psychiatrist, I will not be able to answer. I think when it comes to paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea, I would always want this patient to be evaluated by a cardiologist and a pulmonologist to make sure the appropriate measures are addressed. Somehow, it is just not psychiatric presentation. People have got up in the night like this with similar presentation. I would always look at differentials here, looking at a psychological angle here. Sometimes people have had nightmares. They have a sort of panic attack in the night. Sometimes they get up. Sometimes people have had frightening dreams, and these dreams can also present with this sort of getting up.
So I think most of the questions have been taken care. There are no more questions left. No, there has been exhaustive interactive session after following your vivid presentation. I am very sure that all of us have really learned a lot of things in managing these patients, especially whenever there is an overlap of psychiatry and a patient who is breathless. So we cannot overlook the mind frame or the temperament of a person, and we should definitely suspect those are, although maybe may not be very commonly seen, but those disorders in the patients who are coming to the clinician, as you correctly said, like there is the role of pulmonologist, the psychiatrist, and also one shouldn't forget the cardiologist. So these are the cases who actually should have a specialty consultation from all these subspecialties, if indicated, of course. And there are various modalities of evaluating individually. So the individual subspecialist would consider the individual investigations for this patient. So I think we have really had a very good discussion today. Thank you, Dr. Mahesh Gowda, and thank you, CCI, for having thought of me to moderate this session. There are plenty of questions, I know, in many minds, but whatever displayed on the window we have been well covered now. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for the opportunity, sir. I would like to thank Dr. Ravindra for moderating this session. I would like to thank the organizers and Dr. Vijay in particular. He is helping me coordinate this program. It was wonderful being a part of CCI, and Dr. Krishna has been always a motivator, and he gets interesting topics. So I'm glad this sort of liaisoning has begun. It's just an overview of trying to understand how psychological parameters play an important role in management. As and when case comes up, if we have the iota of doubt to see if it is psychological, actually can save a lot of other issues of management, investigation, and better outcome is what I thought. I thank the organizers for this opportunity, and I thoroughly enjoyed this program. And thank you for the technical assistance that was provided by CCI. And good night, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.